Welcome to our Thursday research seminar, our first of 2020. We are thrilled today to welcome Professor Austin Carson. Austin is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago, which is a small community college nestled in the Windy City. He's widely respected as an expert on the way in which countries use covert action and secrecy in international relations, and he's really a trailblazer in thinking about these issues. His first book was Secret Wars, Covert Conflict in International Politics, which was released from Princeton in 2018, and today he'll be talking about a second book project that it will be coming out in the not too distant future with its co-authors Allison Carnegie, and the topic is Secrets in Global Governance, and we look forward to hearing what Austin has to say. And per norm, he'll speak for 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to conversation starting with our fellows and then expanding outward from there. So Austin, welcome to CSAC.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much, Colin. Thanks to everyone for coming. I'm super excited to be here and talk to you about this new book project that's still in the works, and also something that Allison and I plan to kind of riff off of once it's actually out in the wild. So it's a great time to get comments and reactions and thoughts. So as Colin said, it's called Secrets in Global Governance, Disclosure Dilemmas and the Challenge of International Cooperation. And I want to motivate the book in two ways. First, start with a couple of empirical puzzles. For example, we start the book talking about a case in 1998 when Brazil and Canada basically exchanged accusations of unfair subsidies for their aircraft industry. And each side actually had information based on firms in their territory and the profits and losses of those firms that could demonstrate and substantiate their claims in a World Trade Organization trade dispute, but chose to hold that information back. And the question is, of course, why? In a parallel example in the nuclear realm, in the 1980s, the U.S. had information about the North Korean nuclear program that could have helped facilitate international pressure and potentially roll back North Korea's progress in developing a nuclear weapon at the time, but the U.S. chose not to share it. And the question there for us is why? And the answer that I'll go into in quite a bit more detail in the talk has to do with the nature of that information, the way that knowledge had been gained. Basically, it was sensitive information. In the case of the firm details related to a trade dispute, that information was sensitive because rival firms could use that same information to gain insights of commercial value. So if you're, say, in the United States context, you're Boeing, you're not really that eager to provide the information that could substantiate a trade dispute case, if that's going to give information to rivals who could hurt you in the commercial sector. And in the case of North Korea and the intelligence about their nuclear progress, revealing intelligence and certain kinds of intelligence could jeopardize the sources and methods that the United States carefully protects as it gathers information. It could also reveal simply the fact that the Americans know about certain activities that the North Koreans may not know the Americans know about. But there's a second way in which this book, we think, is an important exploration of information and cooperation, and that is because there are real policy challenges that draw on and reflect the challenges of sensitive information. So if atrocities take place, if ethnic cleansing takes place during a civil war, how do we as an international community or leaders in the United States ensure accountability for leaders that have authorized those war crimes? Or to return to the nuclear domain, if there's clandestine, hidden nuclear development that takes place in a foreign country, how can American leaders or leaders in Europe or other countries make an institution like the IAEA an effective rather than an aspirational tool for addressing the prospect of nuclear proliferation? So what we identify in the book is essentially a problem and a solution, and my talk will focus both on unpacking the nature of this problem and thinking about this institutional solution that we develop. The problem we refer to throughout the book as disclosure dilemmas. And those are an information problem in which governments have both an incentive and a deterrent to share information about rule-related behavior that other governments are engaged in. So essentially, states and firms often have unique insights about whether particular actors are in compliance with the rules of the international system. It might be trade discrimination rules, it might be the rules against war crimes, or the rules against proliferation of military technology in the nuclear realm. That information can be sensitive if its exposure to a sort of broad public audience or to other governments, widely sort of broadly construed, could cause harmful adaptations, which I'll flesh out in a bit more detail in a second. And just sharing the conclusions of that information rather than the raw details is oftentimes not a credible way to substantiate your claim. If you just say North Korea is doing something naughty over here in this city, that's usually not going to be enough. You need to reveal the nature and particular activities that you know about and how you know about that. The same thing for a Brazilian aircraft producer that just says, we lost profits because of Canada's subsidies for its own Canadian production. That's not going to be believable, especially in a legalized setting like a World Trade Organization dispute. And so revealing those details becomes manifests this disclosure dilemma. The center of the book is this institutional solution that we think has been out there for a couple of decades, but hasn't really been identified or theorized by scholars of international politics and IOs in particular. And that institutional solution we generally refer to as confidentiality systems, and that's essentially equipping IOs with a secrecy capacity. IOs with confidentiality systems, international organizations with confidentiality systems, can receive sensitive information, assess it, protect the sensitive details, and then disseminate the conclusions along with corroborating evidence that they obtain through a variety of means to help influence ultimately how other governments and civil society understands a question of compliance. And the result is that sensitive information, if disclosed on this confidential basis to an IO, can actually change the course of something like a trade dispute or a proliferation debate. And if those protections can be provided, those confidentiality protections, by the IO, our argument is that we should see that that kind of sensitive information is shared more frequently and that it should make that international organization, and by extension the international community or the broad set of states participating in a regime, more effective in their efforts to address something like the illegal drug trade, or enforcing a peacekeeping promise, or preventing proliferation. But while you'll generally get a positive vibe from our story in this talk, we want to be very careful in this book to strike a sort of balancing note, that this isn't all good news. Not all states have the same access to this kind of sensitive information. So when you actually look at how this works in practice, what we're also identifying is a subtle form of informational power, that states with that those sensitive insights and willing to provide that insight to an international organization can nudge that organization's scrutiny and the wider international community's perceptions and actions in directions they might not otherwise go. The second reason it's not all good news is that in building these confidentiality systems in IOs, you're essentially endowing these institutions with a secrecy function we typically associate with states. Now, for me, that's super interesting because I've been studying secrecy at the state level for my first book for years. And I started, when I looked into this project, seeing at institution after institution similar kinds of policies, which I'll describe in a minute, that made them look awfully similar to the kinds of things that you see in a national security bureaucracy in a place like the United States. But it was being replicated at a place like the IAEA or the WTO. We think there's a real normative tension there between what people are expecting these institutions to do and how they're going to do it in a transparent manner, and the secrecy these institutions are using to address these disclosure dilemmas, but I think as a byproduct, potentially doing some harm to their legitimacy and their claims to being transparent institutions. So the key findings of the book are that when international organizations have these confidentiality systems, we should see more disclosures of sensitive information. We should see institutions identifying noncompliance and compliance more effectively and more convincingly. The cooperative goals, as a result, should be more likely to be met. Well, of course, that doesn't always happen. But that disclosure should be shaped by political relationships. So what I'll get into in a minute is the way that governments that do have this sensitive information and are confident it can be held confidentially at an IO do not just go recklessly sharing that information. They do it according to their political interests. So we find this pattern across 4 domains in the book. I'm going to go into 2 of them today, but I'll mention the other 2 as well. And we consider some extensions beyond those 4 domains in places like peacekeeping, health, and environment. In general, we use a multi-method approach in the book. It involved a lot of data collection and trying to get fairly creative to try to see some of these things, which are not always easy to monitor. We do some statistical tests in our economics focused chapters. We do a fair amount of archival research for some of the other chapters. And we did a fair number of elite interviews, both in Washington and at the headquarters of a couple of the IOs that we look at. All right, so why does any of this matter? First of all, we think it provides a twist on the classic answer for why and how do states cooperate. The classic answer has, since Cohen, and many other authors after, have developed how information is important for cooperation promises to be believed under anarchy, and institutions without enforcement powers, but still with the power to improve access to information, can help make that cooperation more common and more successful. We say that when, in a special case, you're talking about information that's sensitive, why dissemination by an institution like an IO is actually going to be counterproductive. That makes it easier for firms to adapt to that new information, for actors who gain information about intelligence sources and methods to adapt. And so that's actually counterproductive, and that's why in our story, you actually need institutional non-transparency to achieve a better understanding of how compliance is actually taking place in the world. So it's compliance transparency requires, paradoxically, institutional non-transparency. We also think that it's important because it gives some new insights into how power politics and international organizations intersect, something that has often been treated separately or sometimes been looked at with things like vote buying at the UN through like development assistance bribery type things. We are focusing instead on how there's an under-theorized form of power in terms of sensitive information provision or not, and that part of national security strategy can involve harnessing rather than bypassing international organizations through this kind of information provision. And lastly, as I said, our second motivation in many ways is addressing difficult policy problems. And so we have some lessons here, both for governments that can provide that information and for the institutions that have to walk this fine line oftentimes between their traditional roles and this confidentiality role in addressing things like war crimes accountability and nonproliferation. So with that, let me dive in a bit into, with a bit more detail into the theoretical framework we develop in the book. So first, let me define a few of the key terms that I'll be talking about in the rest of the talk. First of all, I mentioned disclosure dilemmas. To be precise, we refer in that instance to situations which feature a mix of incentive and disincentive to disclose sensitive information. And in the book, we specifically are looking at sensitive information that's relevant to questions about compliance with international rules. And as I said, we construe that broadly to be everything from norms to formal laws, to be domains like human rights, as well as economics and security issues. Those incentives and disincentives we have special names for in the book because we want to get a little bit more precise than just incentives and disincentives. The book talks about the difference between incrimination benefits and adaptation costs. The incrimination benefits are normative, geopolitical, or other gains for the state that is disclosing information that are only obtained if information is shared more widely. If you keep that information bottled up within your government and don't share it, then you don't achieve some normative, geopolitical, or other benefit. It's any reason showing noncompliance is helpful to that government that knows that information. And competing with this are the adaptation costs. Those are the behavioral changes that are enabled by wide access to sensitive information. In the case of the economic chapters we looked at, they are specific to firms and firm-level details allowing for commercial advantages to rival firms. For national intelligence, which is what I'm going to focus on in the applications I'm going to talk about today, we focus on the revelation of sources and methods, but you can think of a variety of reasons why making intelligence widely available can do damage to the intelligence collector. So we're looking at these disclosure dilemmas that arise when you have situations where a government is both incentivized through these incrimination benefits to provide that information beyond their borders, but also deterred in a way from providing that information in a widely accessible way because of these adaptation costs that can accompany disclosure. And the last piece of the sort of theoretical framework are these confidentiality systems. So to precisely define that, by that we mean organizational measures that can limit access to sensitive information. That includes a variety of specific procedures and changes that an institution, any governance institution, local, state, national, or international, might undertake. That includes lock and key systems. You actually have a room where you store sensitive information and only certain people get into it. It can be a system for redactions or information withholding. You maintain a policy of publicly releasing a quarterly report, let's say, but you develop procedures for redacting or removing sensitive information. If those procedures aren't in place, it's hard for you to guarantee to someone who's going to give you sensitive information that it won't be made public intentionally or unintentionally. It can include changes to information technology systems, creating an air gap between databases that store sensitive information and the wider network within an organization, and of course the wider World Wide Web. It could include encryption techniques for storing information and communicating information. It can include simple things like personnel rules. Interviewing people at the IAEA who described revising their personnel policies to include a clause that says, if you disclose information on an unauthorized basis, we can take away your pension. And talking to that person and saying, what tools do you have to stop an international civil servant from leaking information? And then saying, not a whole lot. It's not like we have jurisdiction to put them in some kind of jail, but we can take away their pension, and that does constitute something of a deterrent for some people. So something nitty-gritty like that, providing overall a system of confidentiality. That's what we're talking about. So the central theoretical claim putting these terms into action is, number one, that sensitive information and cooperation are closely linked. First of all, we argue that timely and accurate information about compliance, whether it's compliance with international trade rules or compliance with rules against military nuclear development, timely and accurate information about that compliance is really important to cooperation, and it's really hard to obtain oftentimes. And that information is important, of course, because if you can demonstrate that a country has violated the rules, be it a trade violation or something else, that can allow for the decentralized punishment and decentralized deterrence that is what happens in an anarchic setting. None of this assumes that there's some international police force that can address noncompliance. But in order for states themselves to enforce their own rules, they need to know when states are violating the rules and when not. And that requires timely and accurate information. That information is hard to find, and we essentially argue that they're underutilized resources. Intelligence capabilities of national governments, intelligence that they're collecting either intentionally to assess whether or not rules have been violated. For example, is the NPT being violated by North Korea in 1988? That's a question the intelligence community in the US would ask. But there are also instances we find where the intelligence community of the United States or of other governments is directed to simply looking at things that have less obvious security implications. Are there human rights violations taking place in the civil war in the Congo? That's something that might be something that's interesting and important, especially if it's prioritized as a matter of policy. So those are underutilized resources, sources of information about timely and accurate sources of information about compliance. And the same could be said for the kinds of information that firms routinely collect that can help a World Trade Organization judge assess whether or not a trade barrier has done damage. Our second step in our theoretical claim is that international organizations can help states escape disclosure dilemmas, provided they can protect this sensitive information. So the idea here is when the system is working, governments are disclosing directly and only to an international organization the sensitive information. The international organization then uses its in-house technical expertise to vet that information. They combine it with other sources. They use that sensitive information as a tip or a lead to then go collect additional information using their own authorities or by asking questions and getting it from other governments that supplement what was provided on a sensitive confidential basis. So as you see, this confidentiality system and the process of utilizing it for this purpose draws on other I/O capabilities like inspection authorities or legal expertise in assessing international trade rules. Puts those and combines those with the insights that sensitive information can provide and does a better job assessing whether or not compliance has taken place. So we argue that when the information is shared on a confidential basis, that can improve the likelihood of finding instances of noncompliance. That's the real payoff. And that addresses that incrimination benefit. If you remember, I defined incrimination benefits which are for the disclosing actor, the state that has that information, the benefits, geopolitical, normative, or otherwise, that it gets when noncompliance is identified. And a confidentiality system protects at the same time the sensitivity of that information. So it minimizes those problems, those adaptation costs that a government faces or a firm faces when if that information were made more widely available. Now, as I said, this isn't just a story about institutional capabilities and then governments just willingly sharing information if the confidentiality system that we describe is in place. And that's because we think under anarchy and the reality of international politics, geopolitics is relevant here. So the basic idea is that you don't incriminate your friends. That's a core thesis of our argument. Demonstrating that a government has violated the rules, whether it's nuclear nonproliferation or rules against war crimes, it's not a good idea to do that if it's your ally. The ally's reaction will generally be against your national interest or your security interests, and it can have a series of sort of second-order effects by getting an ally in trouble. So demonstrating violations by allies is generally unwise. Information sharing, as I think all of us would probably understand, is inherently political. Information is not just technical. It also has a political valence to it. And so essentially we think that this means there's a constraint on the kind of actors about whom information will be shared, even in a world where that confidentiality system is in place. But you have to remember there isn't only one information supplier. So that third bullet point is important, and I'll return to this a bit later. International organizations, therefore, really have an incentive to rely on a range of information suppliers to maintain their credibility and neutrality. If they're only getting information from one state, and that state is only getting the information for governments they aren't particularly in favor of, then you have a case where an international organization sort of, if it has that sort of reputation for even-handedness, it's definitely going to be affected by that. But if you're soliciting information from actors with a range of interests and friends and allies of a different nature, then you're going to get a range of information about a bunch of different actors. So a couple of caveats for things that you may have already started to wonder about that we either aren't claiming or want to be clear that we aren't over-claiming. So first of all, we aren't arguing that all sensitive information will be trusted even in an I/O with a confidentiality system. There are certain kinds of sources and methods, for example, that the United States or the British or other states with advanced intelligence capabilities will simply never provide to an I/O, no matter what promises, and cross your heart and swear on whatever, that they won't provide that information. So this is for sort of like, if you think of a spectrum, there's information that isn't sensitive, there's information that's sort of mildly sensitive, which can be disclosed if confidentiality is in place, and then there's extremely sensitive information, which doesn't even go to, for the US, Five Eyes or something like that. Secondly, we would readily acknowledge that some international organizations are simply too weak for this to be worth trying. Their other accompanying powers don't do a whole lot. So you can confidentially share something with an institution that doesn't do much. That isn't really worth doing. And we would also readily admit that I/Os can leak. And that's one of the spin-offs we're thinking about developing in the future, is looking at instances when I/Os actually have hemorrhaged information and how states react to that. Our theory would obviously, well, maybe it's not obvious, our theory would predict that if a confidentiality system is in place but there is a leak, that ruptures the confidence of the discloser that their information will be kept, under lock and key, and so there should be a retraction of disclosures, return to withholding information after that. We totally think that some states simply don't value the cooperation goals of a regime, and so whether confidentiality systems are in place or not, they could give two hoots, because they don't actually want an international organization to address that problem. If you participate or benefit from or profiteer from the international drug trade, it doesn't matter if you've got an I/O now capable of accepting sensitive information to address the drug trade, you don't want it addressed. If you don't particularly care about restraining nuclear proliferation, the IAEA's absence or presence of a confidentiality system is not going to change how you react to it. So we're really looking at the governments who actually do value, either for strategic, for normative, or a blend of both, or some other reason, the goals of the institution and the underlying cooperation effort that the institution is meant to address. Fourth, some cooperation challenges are just too hard. So there are instances where even a super-enabled international organization that pairs sensitive information with other capabilities and does what it needs to do, it simply can't address the problem. There are tough nuts to crack, and so this isn't a sort of silver bullet necessarily. And lastly, we want to be clear that we think in the case of the intelligence chapters, which I'll get into in a second now, that intelligence does important work, but it doesn't do all the work. Other capabilities of I/Os are being tapped into when intelligence is disclosed. And as I said, intelligence oftentimes serves the purpose of being a tip or a lead that then can be supplemented with other kinds of information. So there's a kind of snowball effect when sensitive information is integrated into an IO, which we want to sort of be accurate in what we're attributing what to. Okay, so this is a quick graphic, a different way of showing some of the claims that we're making here. We're taking sort of the perspective of you are a government who has this sensitive information, okay? And you're thinking about what to do with it. And so at that first node, we're saying you ask the question, do you even have an incentive to take this information and make it more widely available? Is there an incrimination benefit to showing that another government has violated the rules? If you don't, if there is no incentive to do so, then you're on the bottom branch there and you simply withhold that information. You don't do anything with it other than keep it to yourself. If you do have an incrimination benefit, the next question to ask yourself at that second node is there an adaptation cost? Is there some downside to making that information widely available? Because sometimes you can find evidence through sensitive means of a violation of the international rules, and you can just make that public. And there isn't really any downside to it. Maybe there's no real sources of methods concerns or something. If that's the case, you can disclose it publicly, as you see on that second downward branch. If there is an adaptation cost, now we're in a disclosure dilemma world because there's an incrimination benefit and an adaptation cost. Now, what do you do in a disclosure dilemma world? That's where our argument is. It depends on what this IO's capabilities are. If there's a confidentiality system in the IO, that's the third question you ask yourself at that third node. If it doesn't have that confidentiality system, then you're generally going to withhold that information. If it does have that confidentiality system, we think the logical response is to disclose it narrowly to that international organization. So that's kind of how we think about things. As you'll see, for at least one of the applications, we take the same graphic and kind of adapt it to each of the chapters empirically and show what we're varying and what we're not varying as a way to make clear that this framework gets kind of pressed into each of the four empirical areas. So to be concrete about it and social sciencey about it, we get two hypotheses out of our theory. Number one is a hypothesis about what you do with the information. The second hypothesis is about what the ultimate outcome is. So we expect when IOs have a confidentiality system that sensitive information disclosure should be more common. And states and not firms are more likely to disclose about geopolitical rivals than they will about geopolitical partners, allies, depending on how you want to define that. So that's that geopolitical element. Essentially, we should see more disclosures after an IO develops confidentiality systems, conditional on it being a non-ally. Secondly, on the ultimate behavioral outcome, our theory suggests integrating sensitive information in this way should improve the visibility of noncompliance and ultimately improve some kind of tangible, visible, measurable cooperation outcome. So as you'll see, I'll talk about the number of sensitive enrichment and reprocessing facilities that are closed in countries for which intelligence has been disclosed in the nuclear realm. That's one indicator we think, an imprecise indicator, a noisy indicator, sure, but one indicator, if intelligence is helping the IAEA and the international community do this better, should be something that changes after those confidentiality reforms. In the case of war crimes, we're going to look at the number of indictments, specifically for high-level war criminals, through the ICTY and the ICTR. These are the Yugoslavia and Rwanda ad hoc international criminal tribunals. And those indictments should be more common if they're getting the sensitive information from states that they derive from intelligence, and it should be less common if they're not. So overall, the four empirical chapters that we cover in the book include the nuclear and war crimes that I've referenced, international trade, which I also mentioned at the top, and then a chapter on foreign direct investment, in which the trend of the IO is actually from more secrecy in the past to less secrecy and more transparency in the present, and we look at sort of the opposite change. The other ones, the change chronologically is towards more confidentiality systems in the recent past. And so I'll focus just today on the nuclear and war crimes. Each of these chapters does a little something different for the theory. The nuclear chapter focuses on intelligence collected about states and their compliance with the non-proliferation rules. The war crimes chapter, as you'll see, is actually about intelligence regarding individuals and their individual culpability with war crimes rules. And so that is a sort of extension of the framework into individuals and not states and their compliance. The trade and investment have their own features related to sort of firm behavior and state behavior regarding trade and foreign direct investment rules as well. So the nuclear, first I'll go through the nuclear application fairly quickly. The nuclear proliferation chapter, which a version of some of this is in an HAPS article that came out last year. looks at the effect of confidentiality system changes that happened in the early 90s on the disclosure of the United States of intelligence, as well as the effect that ultimately had on the closure of sensitive facilities. So to run through that same graphic, if you're a government like the United States with intelligence about proliferation behavior, you're thinking about, is this a non-ally or not? Are there risks to sources and methods? And is the IAEA, the IO in this case, able to protect the sensitive information or not? And in the chapter, what we do is look at a roster of countries, some of whom are allies and some of whom are non-allies. And we try to show that matters for the intelligence disclosure patterns in accordance with the theory. And we also look at before and after the confidentiality reform. So we're varying that third component over there on the IO design to see whether or not there's a change in the frequency of disclosure after a confidentiality system is added. So the nuclear domain we think is a useful way to explore the theory and assess the theory, in part because intelligence can clearly give unique insight into the infrastructure, the procurement patterns, and indications of evasion of inspectors that other sources of information might not be able to provide. Intelligence in the nuclear domain is obviously also sensitive. It can disclose particular kinds of sources, whether they're technical or human, which can allow both the state that's under surveillance and in question to adapt, but also other governments. If you're Syria, if you're an Iran, and you learn something based on disclosures related to North Korea, that can be harmful to the actor that's disclosing the information. There's also a bias problem. The US and other governments can't just stand up and claim without providing actual detailed evidence that X government is violating the non-proliferation rules without really suffering serious credibility questions. And this, of course, was sharpened after American claims regarding Iraq and what WMD after 2003, but is a general problem of credibility if evidence is not provided. Lastly, in the nuclear domain, the IAEA does have really useful supplemental powers, which is safeguards expertise and the right to engage in inspections, as well as soliciting information, other kinds of information, technical information, that can be combined with intelligence if it's disclosed. So our research design in the chapter is we're looking at two dependent variables. One is the rate of disclosure of intelligence over time. That's based on archival evidence, which did speak to some of the pre-confidentiality system period. It's mostly based on elite interviews and secondary source work. There's a fair amount of reporting that, out of Vienna that sometimes reports on the disclosure of intelligence, the fact of it, not the actual content of the intelligence, and then a fair amount of stuff that people were willing to talk about on a background basis in elite interviews. The second dependent variable is that closure of enrichment and reprocessing facilities that I mentioned, which the theory would expect to be more common and affected by the provision of intelligence after these confidentiality reforms. We look at two independent variables, which is the relationship between the disclosure, the United States in this case, and the government in question, which would be, are they an ally or not, and whether or not it was before or after these reforms at the IAEA. And in the chapter, we look at the whole full universe of cases, all cases before and after these reforms of countries that have at least pursued nuclear weapons development in the post-NPT era, and assess how the theory does. Now, this is an overall compilation of the findings. I'm not going to go through this in any detail, and it's a little bit obviously hard to see in the back of the room. But basically what you've got is, for a country like, let's say, Iraq, you've got it coded as whether it's an ally or not. It's not a US ally, according to the coding rules of the ATOP data set, for either the period before and after the reforms. And then we look at two periods. Is it before the reform period, how much intelligence was disclosed and how many facilities were closed? That's a 0 and a 0 because intelligence disclosures were very rare before the confidentiality reforms at the IAEA, and facilities closures in Iraq were also rare. In the period after the confidentiality reforms were put in place, so that's the second Iraq row, we code intelligence shared as 2, which in our coding scheme is a lot of, like, more than 2 or 3 instances of intelligence sharing, and the number of facilities that were closed at 5. Now, there's clearly some confounding factors going on here. You have a war against Iraq, you have the end of the Cold War, there's a lot of things to think through. So the second level, which I don't have time to get into with any detail on the slides, is we try to trace some of those specific facilities to intelligence that was provided to the IAEA, because there's actually some detail on what was given to the IAEA. And so if you can kind of trace that line, you can at least improve your sense that it's not these other sort of structural large changes. So we go through that with the full range of cases, assessing the degree to which the confidentiality reforms and the geopolitical relationship relate to both the amount of intelligence shared and the frequency that these ENR facilities were closed. And we go into a fair bit of detail on each of the cases. North Korea is a useful illustrative case, which I'll run through quickly. In the pre-reform periods, this was before 1991, first we wanted to establish the US did have intelligence at the Yongbyon site in particular about activities related to North Korea's nuclear program. In the mid-'80s and the late '80s, as late as 1990 would still count as before that reform period. But time and again, the US sometimes thought about, sometimes didn't even think about, did not disclose that intelligence to the IAEA. The IAEA, as a result, was largely clueless about this particular aspect of North Korean nuclear development. In the post-reform period, after 1991, the US abruptly shifts to a policy of sharing intelligence with the IAEA directly. It engages in briefings with IAEA leadership, both Safeguards leadership and the Director General's office. Prior to their visiting Yongbyon, they analyzed IAEA samples that were collected in North Korea at a lab in Florida and gave those results confidentially to the IAEA. They shared satellite imagery, in particular, which showed North Korean personnel doing things that looked like covering up nuclear facilities and activities right before inspectors arrived. So it was one of the specific things Intel could provide, but other information couldn't provide, was evidence of essentially a cover-up. That information, which the IAEA supplemented with its own information and combined, it didn't include the details of that intel, but included its conclusions to the Board of Governors of the IAEA, was a big reason that board approved in a vote the demand to access those sensitive North Korean sites in the early '90s. Ultimately, diplomacy, not just IAEA activity, led to the agreed framework which blocked the plutonium path, which was being pursued at Yongbyon. Now, obviously, the story continues, and it's a lot more complicated, and North Korea now has a nuclear weapon, but this shows you in a real crystal clear sense how those reforms can make a difference for here, a non-ally, an adversary in the United States. In the longer chapter, I go through, we go through a series of pieces of qualitative evidence. Here, I just want to point you to some of the important lines. This is from a book by Oberdorfer and Carlin on the North Korea program, which describes how, starting in September of '91, the US was supplying intelligence to Blix and his senior aides in Vienna, and they were armed for the first time with extensive independent information about a nuclear program they were checking. This was a new thing. And the IAEA leaders and the inspectors that were on the ground were able to determine and not be hoodwinked or embarrassed. North Korea became a test case for these new capabilities, and taking no chances, the IAEA chief would miss anything. US officials gave specific briefings in September of '91, March of '92, and May 7th, right before they went in country to North Korea. In our interviews, people recollected this, a decade or so later, and described how over time, intelligence sharing with the IAEA became relatively routine, that the IAEA had developed a rigid protocol by the late '90s at least, for handling information within the Secretariat, and it had a track record of not leaking that information. And over the years, one interviewee said the IC had become much, much more comfortable sharing information with someone like the IAEA. So overall, the pattern is that US intelligence disclosures were very rare to the IAEA before '91. Why? It was in part because the IAEA had no willingness and no capability to protect sensitive information. That all changed in '91. Geopolitics, of course, mattered, though. Even after those changes, the US didn't wantonly share intelligence. It did so, as that large table is meant to show, only for those non-allies that the US had an incentive to incriminate. And so the North Korea case shows that change over time and the unique value added that intelligence can provide, helping to provide, in the case of the IAEA, specific information that documents where activities are taking place or where cover-ups are taking place, and helping to convince swing board members in the Board of Governors to endorse tough resolutions on a country they might otherwise equivocate on. Okay, the other application that I want to run through briefly is war crimes. Here we look to identify the role of intelligence and disclosed intelligence when it is in documenting high-level leader culpability for war crimes on the ground. One thing that's interesting about the war crime setting is it's a formal legal setting. This is a trial with a prosecutor and a judge and a decision with someone serving jail time if they're guilty. And that means that you don't just need information, you need evidence. And evidence sharpens the importance of things like intelligence, whether it's signals, intercepts, or imagery that can be concrete, documentable proof rather than hearsay or claims by witnesses of a particular person's role in a particular war crime. Evidence is particularly useful for documenting high-level leaders. What we found in our research is that time and again, the folks involved in these war crimes tribunals would say, we can implicate low-level military leaders or non-governmental leaders in war crimes just based on witness testimony. I saw this guy here when they were killing people. But being able to implicate people up the chain of command who are not physically present at the site of the war crime requires documenting communications and the structure and the hierarchy of command and control within a military unit, which is something that witnesses are not going to have access to. So in the chapter, we look at both the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, and for Rwanda. I'm just going to run through some of the results from the ICTY for the purposes of time, but happy to talk about the ICTR. The bottom line is we show that the US explicitly, along with its partner governments like the UK, negotiated terms with the Criminal Tribunal Secretariat to protect sensitive information. When they did, they started sharing it. When they shared it, they started releasing indictments on high-level leaders. We don't think that's a coincidence, but it was only for leaders that the US was not interested in protecting. And so geopolitics, again, mattered in this case. So it's similar research design as the other one. I'm just going to run through this quickly for the purposes of time. Where we're varying the IO design. It added a confidentiality system after its initial design, and we're varying or allowing and looking at observations that vary the political incentives, whether or not a particular leader was not necessarily an ally, but at least a partner. So for example, Milosevic, the US saw as a really important partner, first with the Dayton Accords after Bosnia, and then later during the Kosovo War with the peace agreement to end that. And only after Milosevic allowed and authorized a massacre in 1999 did the US decide to share that intelligence with the ICTY, after he no longer was valuable as a diplomatic negotiation partner. So we look at a series of within-case variations within the chapter chronologically and by sort of geopolitical relationship with specific leaders. And in the when the IO does not have a confidentiality system, when the tribunal doesn't, our prediction is that that intelligence should be withheld. And then after it adds it, it should only be shared for high-level leaders that, in this case, the US does not see as useful politically for something like diplomacy. So those are our predictions. And we ultimately find evidence that's pretty consistent with that expectation, that the United States withheld intelligence prior to 1996 because, in part, they didn't want to expose or endanger their on-the-ground assets. And without a confidentiality system, they thought that was likely. After the reform, the US does become much more open in disclosing intelligence to the ICTY. The US had been gathering, as a organized effort, had been gathering evidence of war crimes throughout the wars in the former Yugoslavia. It was only a question of whether they provide that information to the tribunal. And then even after reforms, we show that as long as Milosevic was useful as a sort of piece in the diplomacy and peace negotiations, the US was reticent to share even that intelligence, even after a confidentiality system was in place. He was seen as a possible architect of peace, or at least a guarantor of the Dayton Accords, and Clinton administration officials avoided, as one write-up described it, turning decisive intelligence over to the ICTY, despite a flood of information inside the US intelligence community that clearly established his responsibility. Then in 1999, at Bajak, he authorizes a massacre, and the US deems that as evidence that he's basically not an honest partner in peace negotiations to end the Kosovo War, and so that leads them to release intelligence that supplements and supplies an indictment on Milosevic and his top aides. So in conclusion, we try in the book to identify a common cooperation problem. We think that crops up in a couple of different domains and is hopefully widely useful to scholars in things like security economics and human rights. It focuses on the relationship between sensitive information that only some governments have and its ability to document whether behavior is in violation of international rules. We think it gives a new twist on the role of intelligence in IR, like Intel is already its own little backwater of research. I can say that as a participant in the backwater. And IOs is its own specialty. You put them together and there's almost nothing. So we're hoping to show that there actually is some reason to put some Intel and IO conversation to happen. And we also think there are promising extensions, although we don't know enough about these areas yet to really say anything in confidence, to places like peacekeeping, to attribution of cyber attacks, and other domains where there's uncertainty and it's hard to establish the existence of rule violations and responsibility for it. We also hope the book provides a new story for what IOs can do to facilitate cooperation, that IOs are functioning through the secrecy process rather than through the traditional transparency process. But it is, of course, important not overemphasize, but to appropriately emphasize that disclosure by these actors is a political act and is shaped by geopolitical interests. For future work, we're thinking about how do we bring these policy implications, the policy implications of the book, to policy audiences. There are implications both for if you are in the White House and thinking about how do I harness this kind of information and the powers of an international organization to achieve my goals. So sort of policy implications for the states disclosing. And then there's also important implications for how not to screw this up as an international organization. Don't take information from one government. Don't triangulate and be very transparent in how you're vetting information so it doesn't look like you're just following the lead of whoever provided you intelligence. And lastly, we're thinking a lot about how this can go sideways, how IOs can leak information, how it can damage IO credibility, and how we think about reconciling a secrecy role in something like a global governance institution with other normative priorities like transparency and accountability. So with that, I'm excited to hear people's reactions and questions, and thanks for your patience.
Great. So I'm interested in whether your theory can explain anything about the timing of disclosures post-reform, and whether there could be maybe interesting variation in the magnitude of adaptation costs that affect predictions about whether we would see disclosure earlier or later as like a proxy for learning abilities.
So what do you have in mind about like sort of adaptation costs changing over time? Is it your sense like?
So I'm wondering if like if you expect your adversary would be able to adapt to the disclosure of this information relatively quickly and really act on it,
Yes.
then you would be much more hesitant to delay disclosure.
I think that's entirely right. Like, but there's sort of the question, you can answer the question in terms of the logic of the theory and the question of like the pragmatics of empirical research. In terms of the logic of the theory, you're exactly right. As adaptation costs become more severe, both in terms of what they can do can hurt you more, and what they can do fast rather than after a slow period of painful, whatever, behavioral and organizational change. The sharper those adaptation costs are, the more reluctant you are going to be to disclose. And you're going to need really powerful assurances of confidentiality in an IO to make that happen. Or maybe you'll wait and provide that information at a later time when those adaptation costs are less severe. That's another option to get to sort of your timing question. As a question of sort of like pragmatic empirical research, the thing that we ran up against was we found it very difficult without being on the inside to understand and be able to document the magnitude of adaptation costs for different kinds of intelligence. It's like we can tell stories that like the intuition's there, but actually systematically collecting data on that we found to be basically impractical for an outsider. So that's why, in all honesty, that's why we try to conceptualize adaptation costs as sort of on the whole being relatively similar within the nuclear domain for intelligence about foreign programs, and then look at how variation in the IO's capability and in the incentive you have to disclose, that incrimination benefit, geopolitical stuff, is driving these different outcomes. But in truth, you're completely right that adaptation costs vary, and that should have a very important impact on what is shared, how it's shared, and when it's shared.
Great, so we'll go to Reed next, and just as a reminder, since Austin doesn't know everybody, give him the one sentence bio as the preface for your question. So Reed, and then Julian, and then Dia.
Yep, I'm Reed Hawley, a Stanton Fellow here at PubStock. So my question is about within the IOs, secrecy from whom, and how you obviously thought about that and theorized the utility then of that secrecy. So if I share intelligence with the IAEA, and I'll use that a lot because that's probably the only thing you presented that I know anything about, but you give information to the IAEA, and it could either be passed on to the state that it's about. So like the Iranians know what you've given the IAEA. It could also be passed to just any other member of the organization, potentially barred by some privileged access, right? So the IAEA has a board of governors, right?
Yep.
So that board of governors states, member states of the board of governors
Right.
get more information than the rest, the other subset of the,
Yep.
the organization. So there's like internal distinction. And then there would be something that's just like general public leaking,
Yep.
which might have to do with your prior work. And I'd love to know if you thought about that.
Yeah.
But then just the reason this comes up as a question is that the United States, I believe, and Colin, I hope will shed some more light, continue to share intelligence with the IAEA, even though I assume we knew that Iran had the IAEA penetrated, right? And the Atomic Archive revelations show that the Iranians knew everything the IAEA was talking to each other about prior to conducting inspections in Iran. Now, we might make a case that like that didn't actually matter for detecting Iranian violations, but it does suggest that the United States was choosing the information to share much more than it cared about whether the organization was penetrated. It assumed it was penetrated.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a zillion things that question brings up. It's a great question. No, it's a sign. It's a good question. So, in no particular order, the thoughts that provokes. One important thing when I went and did interviews at the IAEA was to answer the question I had in my mind, which was, do disclosures of intelligence really think the IAEA is unpenetrated by foreign intelligence? And the answer I got, both from people I interviewed from the US government and at the IAEA, was that there was a certain level of expectation that some usual suspects probably have penetrated the information technology systems or have their civil servants passing information back to them, perhaps. And I heard some, sort of an example, anecdote here or there of sort of instances where that maybe became apparent. So I think number one is that taught me that perfect confidentiality is unnecessary for the process of intelligence disclosure. And that's because exactly the basis of your question, which is that it's a question of who can access it. And so I don't know that much about the Iran file disclosures and what it teaches us. And that came after the research I was doing. So so to be fair, this is something that I'm sort of, would rely more on your expertise for that. My guess, though, is that if the US knew that Iran knew what it was disclosing, first it matters when that was happening. So it may have been the case that a fair amount of that intel was being disclosed before Iran knew. I don't know. Like, I'd have to look at the timeline. But it's also the case, it strikes me, that where we get into this idea that it's not just the target or the kind of country in question that you're worried about adapting, it's also similar countries in a similar position you're worried about adapting. So it may have been useful to the US to disclose to the intel to the IAEA, even knowing Iran might know what the IAEA is receiving, because maybe Syria doesn't know, or some other state of concern doesn't know. And maybe if they're 100% sure Iran's passing all that intel onto that Syrian government, then you've got a problem. There would be a case where adaptation costs would not be minimized in any meaningful sense by the IAEA. So I think it is a question, when we get into the nitty gritty, it's a question of degree, and it's a question of, but it's definitely more than a question of just the country of concern that's in question. And I would then, another comparison to that, or a similar dynamic happens in the ICTY, where the explanation for why it was that governments were unwilling to share intel with the ICTY until its procedures were in place was both because the Serbs would go cover up war crime sites. So that's the country in concern. But there was also a concern that other actors would be able to tell that real-time drone information was being regularly collected in that area, and they may then conduct themselves differently if they were going to engage in ethnic cleansing or displacement of civilians or something. So it's that sort of multiple states means that the IO can actually provide value added even when it's penetrated by the traditional intel services like the Russians, the Americans, and maybe the Chinese, but even adding maybe a country like Iran. But it's a great question.
Carol, you have the two finger, and since you're an honorary fellow.
Just to quickly follow on Dean's question, isn't it also possible that in this case, since you know your other work on covert signaling,
Yeah.
whether the information is, the Iranians know what the US is providing, but the Iranians don't have any interest in decreasing the credibility of the IAEA, because they eventually want to be able to say, oh, the IAEA is inspecting us, it's credible, and therefore this is above board. So neither side has an interest in bringing to the.
I love it. Thank you for knowing my work better than me. I like that. That's a cool idea. The other thing, the other direction you could take it is, the U.S. is not at all necessarily upset that Iran knows that the U.S. is providing intel to the IAEA, because now Iran's going to be much more on the up and up, because it knows the IAEA is much more in on it. So it could be that too, sort of signaling, hey, we know what you're up to, and because we're disclosing it, the IAEA does too. So that's a better answer.
Julian, and then Nandita, and then Maria.
Yes, so I'm Julian Kuchu. I work on the technical aspect of the nuclear program of China and North Korea. So thank you for your talk, and it gave me a bit of a weird idea is, have you seen historically instances where states purposely provide false claim and fabricated proof to our IO? And also, do you think it's worth it to use a similar model as the one you use for authentic claim, but for fabricated or false claim?
Yeah, great question. There is an example. Okay, so there's one example that was publicly reported, which was the Niger uranium claim that the IAEA assessed. I mean, that wasn't confidentially disclosed at that point. It was like publicly reported, but the IAEA did assess it and say, we don't think this is valid. And that's actually, when you talk to folks at the IAEA, that's one of the things they say is, look, like, we're not just like rubber stamping the conclusions of intelligence agencies that share with us, because look, we rejected a claim here. And so that's one example of that. That's not quite, you know, whether that was intentionally manufactured or just it was a mistake is I think a subject of debate. The other thing I would say is I did interview someone who was from a non-US government, who cryptically heard my spiel and then said, don't you think that would create a pretty strong incentive to provide misleading or manufactured information to an international organization that was so endowed? And I was like, okay, I see what you're saying. So I don't know of any specifics, but it sounded like that might be a game some governments are trying to play. You know, thinking about it more theoretically than sort of actual examples, this to us really underscores the importance of this vetting process, which we get into in a little bit of detail in our theory chapter, where all these institutions need to be clear about what they do with this information and how they cross-check it with other information sources they have, which if it's manufactured may well not corroborate. And then for IOs that have the ability to solicit or collect new information, can you take whatever is submitted that you don't know if it's manufactured or genuine, collect additional information, and then begin to connect dots and see whether if they're consistent or not? And so if the process is working well, then we should occasionally get sort of false positives that are disclosed and then invalidated. Now, whether or not those instances are made public or relayed to scholars like me, I think is a separate question, but that's ostensibly what the IO should be doing. It's a good question, though.
Indeed.
I asked you about this as a predoctoral fellow here, also a PhD candidate in political science here at Stanford. So I'm also kind of curious about the temporal variation of this.
Okay.
In particular, now with the proliferation of ICT, secrecy is just much harder, and more importantly, there are alternative sources of intelligence, both just from the domestic public and tech companies and other firms. So I'm wondering how that affects sort of these intercrimination benefits, in large part because states may realize that the same information could go to the IOs anyway.
Yes. Okay, so yeah, a couple of responses on that. One is that what we did learn in our research is that a technique some governments might use is to show a piece of intelligence to the secretariat of an IAEA, let's say, and then say, you might go acquire the same kind of intelligence from the commercial sector, which might not be quite as precise as what we're showing you right now, but then it's something you could pass along to other governments and use and stick in your file. And so the rise, in a sense, the lesson there is that the rise of alternative sources of information at a commercial level or a civil society level has been used in combination with these disclosures to sort of say, here's some really juicy stuff, and then here's what you can do to sort of corroborate that or replace that in a sense which can be used diplomatically more broadly than what we're showing you right now. So they can go hand in hand. But I think you're getting at a second effect of that, which is a sort of narrowing, potentially, if your hypothesis is true, a narrowing of what intelligence provides unique insight into. And so, this may just be a case where you have fewer instances over time as technology evolves, fewer occasions in which you're like, wow, this is really decisive information that they can't get any other way. So I think it would tend to contract, at least if not shrink the incrimination benefits, it would at least shrink the scope of situations in which those incrimination benefits are present, and would make it, a little bit less common of a tactic. I'm personally a little skeptical. Like, I got this question a lot with my first book, where it was like, okay, cool, nice story about the 1950s. We can't have secrets anymore. Why is this relevant? So I have a whole hobby horse I go into about, I think, like, secrecy's alive and well, even though, like, we have camera phones and can get commercial satellite imagery. I think there's a lot of technical and, of course, human means that are not widely available. Let's put it that way. And I don't have a security clearance, and I've never worked in the IC, just so everybody knows. That's just stuff I've learned and gathered.
Maria.
Hi.
Hi, I know you.
Well, you're right. So from a small community college in the Windy City.
Yeah, all right.
So I have two questions, one in the same vein as the previous two, and then one slightly different. So on the question of verification, so the puzzle you started with basically said that without providing this information, the case can't proceed. So if this information is so vital and it's so unique, how can it possibly be verified? So I just wanted you to sort of explain that process a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second question, which is on a slightly different vein. So the IOs have a vested interest in transparency, and in the chapter that you attached to this, you said that this is part of the norms that we're developing after World War I.
Yep.
So if this is very important for IOs to function, why did they actually even start experimenting with transparency in the first place?
Yep.
And then I was wondering if you had any theories about which IOs started this adaptation and which didn't, and why. So who were the first adapters amongst the IOs?
Okay, experiment with transparency.
Sorry, experiment with secrecy.
Oh, with secrecy. Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, and then the second part of that, the 2B was what?
So which IOs started to basically adapt to this secrecy and?
Yeah. Okay. Early movers, right?
Right.
First movers. Okay. Let me do these in reverse order. So, why experiment with secrecy in the first place if a basis of your legitimacy is transparency? In each of these instances, these reforms were triggered by a crisis of legitimacy that was a larger concern than the commitment to transparency. In the case of the IAEA, I didn't get to say this in the talk or didn't have time to. The crisis was the first Iraq war, when the IAEA thought it had a basic sense or tabs on what Saddam Hussein was doing in the late 80s. And when his country was opened up to inspections and the IAEA teams went inside, they saw all kinds of stuff they didn't know about. And the international community and the IAEA secretariat itself said, we've got to do our job differently now, because we used to be, on declared sites, you tell us what you think you're doing, and we're going to go make sure that's right. And what they learned, of course, was that on undeclared sites, you can do whatever the hell you want. And you can do a lot at undeclared sites. Saddam Hussein taught them. So there were a number of reforms, including something called the Additional Protocol, which legally allowed them, if you submit to it as a country, to go to undeclared sites. But they also just started doing other things, like, hey, intel communities, provide us with tips on places that maybe are not being disclosed. That was a greater crisis of legitimacy to the IAEA than risking its transparency. And the same thing for the WTO happened, where they started having these very big cases, in important cases, where they simply could not assess whether or not subsidies or other kinds of trade discrimination tools were having damage on other countries. And they could render a ruling, but the ruling just wasn't going to be very thorough or convincing. And they started to say, well, we'll experiment with ways of protecting business confidential information. And that does reduce our transparency, but that's better than having whole sort of components of international trade law that are very difficult to assess. So that's sort of the, to get over that puzzle, it's about sort of the magnitude of the legitimacy problem. Okay, so if the information is so unique, how can you verify it? I just don't think it's as extreme as you're sort of characterizing it. So I don't think it's that, like, you can't make a claim without this information. There is surrounding corroborating information that may exist prior to intelligence being disclosed, which is either like consistent or inconsistent with what's disclosed in the intel. And then I think the important thing is what questions can you ask after that intelligence, unique intelligence is disclosed? And those questions that you ask and the answers that you get can end up being information that either supports or does not support the validity of what's claimed in the intelligence. Does that seem difficult?
So can I follow up?
Yeah.
So if it's possible for the organization to get supporting evidence without releasing the sensitive information, why can't the state that has to provide the sensitive information just gather the evidence, the surrounding evidence that supports the sensitive information without providing sensitive information in the first place?
Well, yeah, so to get less abstract, right? So if you don't know, so let's take the North Korea case study that I walked through in the nuclear domain. The intelligence is indicating there are these specific buildings at this site at Yongbyon that are doing these kinds of activities. The IAEA, before it has that information, doesn't even have the basis to ask North Korea to go visit Yongbyon because North Korea says this is what Yongbyon is for. The intelligence says it's for something else. So once they have that information in hand, they can go to North Korea and they can say, we would like to go inspect that site. Once they go to North Korea and they inspect that site, the US can't go and inspect North Korean sites. No government can. That's one of the interesting things about the IAEA. And anytime like a country like in the Reagan administration, we thought about starving it of resources, and they did an assessment, and they're like, oh, the IAEA is the only actor that can go inside a lot of these countries. And that's like way richer information than we can collect with our intel. And so that's the way they sort of work in harmony. You give that lead to the actor that has an inspector group. The inspectors go in, and then you use intel to show how the North Koreans are hiding stuff. And now you've got, like I said, a snowballing effect where you give them initial set of information they didn't have, then they can supplement with information they can circulate, and it triggers behavior that then provides additional information that they're hiding something. Does that make sense?
Hi, I'm working with, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska and former CSAC. So this is awesome work. Thank you so much for sharing it. I had a question about your theory and about one of the assumptions, which is that you don't want to incriminate your friends.
Yes.
Which I totally get. I can see that mechanism playing out well, but I wanted to have like a sort of a devil's advocate on your side of that. Which is, let's imagine your friend is unfortunately engaging in nefarious behavior of some sort. And you want to call attention to this, you want to maybe stop that behavior, and the only way to do that is to use the IO rather than yourself, and sort of allow them to do the dirty work for you. And that, if your friend is engaging with nefarious behavior, and assuming it's a friend of the United States, so it's probably a relatively major player in the international system, their nefarious behavior is probably disproportionately or differentially negative for the international community. So I'm thinking here about allies of the United States that engaged in nuclear proliferation. That has a differential impact on the non-proliferation regime that adversaries engaging in it. So using the IO rather than the United States itself to sort of call attention to this behavior could be a beneficial way of getting that out.
Right. Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. Yeah, I think another. No, yeah, no. It's an assumption we make that like I think people can push back on, and like someone can do something on this, like the value of the IO, as it like I actually would think about it as like the IO is like the intermediary. It's like we're not accusing Taiwan of proliferating, the IO is, and so that like reduces the degree to which it's slap in the face. So what we do to justify this assumption, we make the following claim, which is that the premise of what you said is actually quite rare. The premise of what you said is that bilateral means of coercion are insufficient, but the IO would be sufficient. What we essentially point to, drawing on the nuclear context, but I could tell you a story about war crimes, let's say, is that actually with US allies, we have tons of instruments of coercion that aren't available, and that's supported by like other people's work, not just ours. And what that means is that if you get a case like a Taiwan in the 80s, when the US could have disclosed intel, even assuming their confidentiality system had been there, what you actually see is the US is able to threaten withholding various goodies they provide their ally, and that gets them to change their behavior. So I think that's in a lot of cases, other forms of changing that behavior are more effective and oftentimes can be done on the backstage rather than a very highly public IAEA-led effort to coerce an ally. But truthfully, I think oftentimes the U.S. chooses like C, none of the above, where like in the case of like war crimes in Rwanda, like the RFP, which was like the group that won and were victimized initially, but won the civil war. The U.S. wanted to embrace them as a sort of regional partner, and we just looked the other way, and we didn't want the IO to pressure them and change their behavior. We're just like, okay, we're just going to kind of ignore those human rights violations they did, and we're going to supply the ICTR with information about the Hutu genocide, but we're going to absolve the Tutsis for our own real reasons. That's my interpretation of it. And so in that case, you didn't see them doing this behavior because they were just willing to tolerate it. So you don't want to just think about the Israels and the Taiwans of the world. There's a lot of American partners that are where like it's a lack of accountability is tolerable, if that makes sense.
So I'm going to take the chair's prerogative. Oh, sorry, please. I won't take the chair's prerogative. Go ahead.
Okay, Lindsay Call. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here. I have a background in geology, studying nuclear waste. So from what I can collect that, okay, you say IOs are an important tool to correct bad behavior, and they're more effective when there's a confidentiality system in place. And then you gave the example of North Korea in the early 90s. But so what's happened with North Korea since then? I mean, why isn't the IAEA being effective in, continuing to mitigate their nuclear program?
Yeah.
Or elsewhere?
Sure. I think, let's take just North Korea. So part of the story after the agreed framework is actually a story that I think there's different ways you can interpret it, but I think there's one way of interpreting it that's pretty consistent with the argument of the book, which was that in the Bush administration, a separate path to proliferation was identified through intelligence, a uranium enrichment program. And what the US chose to do, in part because the Bush administration was just a little less excited about IOs and the IAEA than the Clinton administration had been, is that they presented the North Koreans bilaterally with evidence that the US knew of their enrichment program. And that kicked off a series of events which, cutting to the chase, basically the agreed framework eventually collapses. The presentation of that intelligence in a bilateral context doesn't end up stopping the North Koreans, and the North Koreans race and detonate a bomb. And so my take on that is twofold. Number one, it in some ways is a lesson that if you had done it through the IAEA, maybe this outcome might have been different. But number two, maybe it's a case of just like some cooperation problems are just like too tough of a nut to crack. So it's possible that like the early 90s is a nice illustration of the theory, but the rest of the post-90s story is a story about how sometimes the IAEA and the international community is just powerless to stop a country that wants to violate the rules, whether they fuel that IO with intelligence or not. And that I could kind of go either way, or maybe both lessons are true. But that's the way that I sort of make sense of the rest of that case.
One way you might try to make sense of that or other cases is the following, is that you sometimes use the term the information is sensitive.
Yeah.
It strikes me that they're two very different things. One is whether the source of the information is sensitive.
Yep.
And the other is whether the information itself is sensitive.
Okay.
So the Clinton administration, Tom can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Clinton administration thought that the North Koreans were cheating and had an enrichment program. But for them, the information that the North Koreans were cheating was sensitive because they didn't want to ruin the other aspects of
the plutonium agreed framework.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
They wanted to keep that going.
The one that existed as opposed to throwing that away.
Yeah. I hear that.
So it wasn't that the sources were
Good.
sensitive.
Yes.
Because we were more public about rolling up the AQ-Con network and such. What was different was whether they wanted to expose sensitive information for broader political.
Yes.
So that is more like what you said was the early case in the ICTY case about not wanting to go after Milosevic because of the potential they had.
Exactly. Right.
I think that would be one way of differentiating.
I think that's
between these cases.
so. I think my language in verbal presentations is a little less precise than the language in the book. We try to stay narrowly focused on sources and methods in the book because we feel like it's clearly sensitive and it's easier to define as like, this is what the adaptation is. That sucks for the country that's collecting intel. But like, we thought long and hard about whether a more capacious definition of sensitive, which included things like, if, regardless of source and methods, if this is disclosed, it has a diplomatic sort of blowback problem. As like also being an example of I think basically that does create a kind of disclosure dilemma, which is independent of sources and methods, and which can lead you to withhold information. But it's a slightly different one than what we're talking about. So I 100% agree. But it's the one I think I'm less sure how to think about how a confidentiality system would actually solve that, because I know I'm riffing on the spot right now based on your question, which has helpfully clarified this. Is that like, okay, so you can disclose that to the IO, to the IAEA, but it's the fact that you know, and can you really have the IAEA protect that information? Is that something that just the IAEA?
You don't want to share it with them because there's no benefit, because you don't want them
Exactly.
to
Yeah.
disclose it.
So I think it's something that is a disclosure dilemma that is not solved by these confidentiality systems. Okay. And those exist.
Amy?
Yeah, so this builds on Scott's question. Really interesting project. I want to push you a little bit on what do you mean by intelligence?
Yep.
So here's an alternative explanation, or at least what I think is a little bit different explanation. That intelligence is more likely to be shared with IOs when there's more intelligence to share.
Right, yeah.
And I mean that not flippantly, right?
No.
So if you think about how much intelligence does a state have about a nefarious act or cheating, how good is that intelligence and how varied are the sources and means?
Yep.
To the extent that if I'm the US, I have much more varied sources and methods, I have a lot of intel and it's good, it's less risky for me to share part of it with the IAEA than if I have fewer of those.
Totally.
Right? So how do you deal with that kind of disaggregation of
yeah.
intelligence piece?
I think that's exactly right. I think if we're the way we handle it is by focusing on the same state and how it behaves on either side of a reform within 4 years, let's say. So we're looking at 1985 versus 1995 in North Korea for the United States. And what our bet, our assumption is, which I'd be happy to hear pushback on, but I'm pretty convinced it's a safe assumption, is that in a qualitative sense, there is not a leap in the amount of intel the US has, in the precision of that intel, or in the variation of sources of intel in the 5 years before and the 5 years after those reforms at the IAEA. What really changes is that you've got an actor now that you can trust to share sensitive information with. So I think if you're talking sort of like cross-nationally and over 20 years, how do we explain variation in whether intelligence is shared or not? That is exactly some of the stuff we would want to look at. But if you're looking, if with the research design we have here, what we're trying to do is show you can actually isolate controlling, in a sense, through the same actor and over time variation, that there is a real significant difference that's made just by the confidentiality system's presence or not. And so, yeah, these are two things that are feeding into these patterns. But, you know, sort of by and large, I think across the files the US has, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and then the stuff it knows about its allies, you know, in that, say, 15-year period surrounding the IAEA's reform, I think that, you know, by and large was pretty similar quality and volume and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, compared to what the Israelis know or compared to what the French know, you might have very different dynamics, and that might explain why the French don't supply it sometimes, even when the US does. So I think I would say, yes, I agree, but I think that what we've tried to do is design the empirical test to ensure that there is a significant amount of play that we can explain with our explanation.
So then your tough test would be, are states sharing the sort of crown jewels of their intelligence when that's all they have? What percent of the good intelligence are they sharing with the IAEA?
I don't know.
Right, not the before, after, but a 10-year period, which is a pretty big period of intelligence gains, right, on both sides of the reform.
I don't know. I don't know the extent to which there were intelligence gains in that 10-year period. But I'm willing to guess that it doesn't explain the bulk of the change that we observed. Is that crown jewel really the test? I mean, that's what I tried to say with that caveat, which is that I think there's a spectrum of sensitivity, and there's like, the crown jewels are on that far end of the spectrum where I don't think it matters what the IO does. That's just not going to the IO. It's maybe not even going beyond 5 eyes. And we don't think any of that information is ever going to be shared as sort of raw signals intercepts from last week. I don't think so. So like that's that to me isn't the test. The test is like, does the information that is plausibly shareable with that kind of an actor, is it shared when the conditions geopolitically are right and when the institutional design is right? And can we see a noticeable difference in the patterns of sharing and the activities, therefore, the IO is able to do? Then I think that's the test. But you're right, is that the toughest test? Maybe it's a tougher test as the sensitivity goes higher. But I still wouldn't put the crown jewels. I wouldn't claim that within the scope of the theory, to be honest.
So I want to ask a couple questions. First of all,
Go
I want
for
to
it.
ask you about your final slide and what you as the book culminates and you talk about kind of the policy prescriptions. And I would encourage you to kind of push, to the outer limits of your comfort level in terms of extrapolating, because I think it'll make for more interesting things. And so, first, I think thinking about the range of security questions that are most pressing now, where these types of designs for IOs might be relevant. You mentioned cyber up there. I can think of other things. So cyber, and I think all sorts of algorithmic attribution questions, which are going to be issues of where sensitive information, both commercial and governmental, are going to be relevant, could not be more important as we think about the implications of cyber and artificial intelligence.
Great. Okay.
So I would really encourage you to think about that part. Second, I think that I think you should at least consider whether climate change is an area here too, because of the ability to track, not only track emissions, which you should be able to do with open source things, but there actually will be sensitive information about whether countries are fulfilling their commitments, their voluntary commitments under Paris or Paris 2.0 or whatever, which are going to be very germane and kind of another sexy area that you might want to think about. A third area are misinformation campaigns, right? So think about how much, whether people trust the information released by the intelligence community on what the Russians did, or so that, as countries are flexing in the information space, are there places where, again, attribution, intent, where you're willing to release sensitive information about keystrokes.
And get the IO to stamp that with it's not just the US's claim, it's an IO's claim. That would be really nice.
The third area. And a fourth area is are kind of the new frontiers of terrorism, especially as they relate to like tailored bioweapons and other things. We're looking for fingerprints of what labs were generated. And anyway, so those are four areas that I think are quite interesting to people. And this addresses a little bit of your 1950s question, right? Which is like, oh, well, this is really interesting from an historical perspective, but what are the issues of today? So anyway, that's just some suggestions.
Thanks.
Take it or leave it. The other place you might want to flex is that obviously the project is fundamentally about when state actors or other actors trust IOs enough to give them sensitive information. But I might flip that question around a little bit, and at least from the historical material that you look at, what are the conditions in which the IOs have sufficient trust in states to actually use their information? Because my guess is that in a lot of these cases, they can't corroborate immediately, but what are the instances in which they have enough faith in the good faith of the actor providing the intelligence that they're willing to do a risky thing like ask for a site inspection or make a charge.
Oh, I see.
That's relevant because there's a lot of concern in the United States that we're burning our credibility fast.
Oh, yeah, totally.
And then I think that there's a difference between some administrations going to the IAEA with information being seen as being on the level and other states not being seen as being on the level. And I think that's actually a relevant policy conclusion about what states can do to make sure that that they have a reputation for credibility with sharing for the IA with IO, so that they actually use the information.
And I like that. Yeah, and I like I would even go to like an interesting level of theorization that got to individual relationships, because I think there is you cultivate trust in the Director General that they'll protect the information. The Director General is also cultivating trust in you and your top level State Department people and IC people who are briefing them that they're on the level. And then if you have an administration that's super skeptical of it, like the current administration perhaps, then that lack of personal relationships might jeopardize that. And there's interesting work on sort of like intel sharing at the state-to-state level and personal relationships that is kind of like informing that idea. The other thing I was going to suggest was, what was it? Shoot, I lost it. Oh yes, your question reminded me of another, like the triangulation of multiple sources of intelligence on the same question is another way that IOs gain trust. So like sort of kind of Maria's question, one thing I should have mentioned there is the IO going and doing the things that IO normally does may not be useful to validate a piece of intelligence-based information, but going to 3 other governments to say, what do you know? And then what they provide may or may not validate it is also something that I know some institutions do. And so the ICTY, for example, was getting very good stuff from the British before it got stuff from the United States, a little bit before the US was getting its stuff. And so that the US information in many ways, although I don't know the details, I'm guessing validated some of the things the British had already been providing. And so that's another thing, is like, this isn't as much of a leap of faith as it might sometimes seem like, if the IO is doing its job right and soliciting information from multiple sources. And if you think to yourself, oh, well, if the Europeans say it and the Americans say it, is that really that different? I mean, if you think about the French and the Americans and how different they view proliferation issues in the nuclear domain, if you get them to say the same things, let alone if the Chinese chime in or something, then you know you've got something. And so then maybe you can make that risky ask to go to a site, let's say. But yeah, otherwise I will totally look into some of those applications. Those sound great. And I like your sort of flipping of it, so.
Yeah, Tom Singer, sorry. I think I lost you, Tom. Hiding behind Scott there, my fault.
Thank you. I am a strong advocate of sharing with international organizations.
So explain your background for those people who don't.
Among other things, I was a deputy director of national intelligence and chairman of National Intelligence Council.
There you go, great.
40 some odd years.
Mildly qualified.
I'd like to make a number of points, more for you to think about and possibly come back, but also to put in context. I think it's really important that you put the context of U.S. priorities as a factor in deciding what gets shared with whom and when. It's not just sensitivity of the intelligence. That you use the example of Milosevic from Dayton. Stopping the conflict in former Yugoslavia had a much higher priority than putting one bad guy in jail on it. And one can argue with that priority, but that clearly was the priority. And there are many, many other examples. That Jim Kelly going to North Korea and talking about the uranium. The judgment of that context was the North Koreans are much more interested in the relationship they're developing with the United States at that time than with the IAEA, which they had demonstrated they were quite willing to throw out.
I see what you mean. So it's a better lever to do it bilaterally.
Provide the better lever. I think it was misplayed by the Bush administration, but that was the logic. So the what can be shared. One of the things you have to factor into this is the intelligence that is provided to the United States or to others by other countries. Very often on the condition that it not be shared.
Okay, good.
Or that it not be shared with specific others. It used to drive me nuts with NATO and the European Union. They all gave us stuff that we couldn't share with other members of the EU. And those kind of bureaucratic constraints apply when you get into something like the IAEA.
For sure,
That third country considerations that, so to say, we knew about Iranian penetration of the IAEA. The concern, much as I remember it, was the relationship they had with North Korea at the time. Sharing stuff on North Korea, the Iranians are going to share with the North Koreans. It wasn't just dyadic. You've got to consider the array of people who talk to one another. The ICTY, I established the War Crimes Unit in the State Department to support that tribunal. The difference between alerting and proving. That it's much easier, under the ICTY, it's Rule 38, that allowed us to provide tips, basically. Look here, chase that, talk to these people. We're not going to provide information that's going to be used in a trial for almost the same reasons that the intelligence community won't share with the law enforcement community in the United States, because you have to disclose it to the defendant. and it's going to be used in open court. But tips to the IAEA or others of look here. An analog of that is the treatment of allies and friends and partners. A part of it, again, is a judgment. A quiet conversation with an ally or a partner, whether or not you're bringing in a lot of leverage beyond reputational risk, often judged to be more effective than publicly shamed. On it. And judgments may be wrong, but those are really relevant to what gets shared. Finally, the Niger yellow kick is a good example. Most intelligence is wrong. Say that out of, and most intelligence from some countries is wrong horrendously. And part of the delay is trying to corroborate, substantiate. It took us less than 1 hour to say that Niger yellow cake is bogus. It happened to come from the Italians. On this, but it got into the system. But you got another layer of complication here when a country provides information to an IO, and the IO wants to know if it is valid. And it goes to somebody else. And gee, do I want to reveal what I know about the capabilities of this other country?
It's Italian stink. No, you don't want to say that.
But all of this is, I think, is great work, and keep doing it.
Wow, thanks. There's a lot. I appreciate that.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And 2020, notwithstanding events in the actual world, is off to a good start.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.